All right, let's jump back into AWS here and let's go over a couple of more examples as to what we can do with AWS. There's two more examples I want to illustrate. One is using the S3 buckets, and the other one is using EC2. We've already illustrated an example with identity and access management. Let's jump into the first two products that AWS ever released back in 2006. So in 2006, AWS made itself available to the world, and they were one of the first companies to go into cloud platforms and offering cloud as a service or infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. What's very interesting is when it comes to Amazon making money, turns out that their most profitable business currently, as of 2023, is AWS. When it comes to their shipping products and you're ordering from AWS, from Amazon, like the shipping and retail, it's not that profitable. Like there's a lot of challenges that they face in making profits there. But it turns out AWS is a very profitable aspect of their business. What's very interesting about this is originally when Amazon was first making itself as a company, uh, they were originally. Do you remember what their original business model was? What was Amazon's original business model?
Books.
Exactly. Yeah. Books that are hard to find, books that you need to order for school, and then they expanded, right? When they built AWS, they actually built this for their engineers. They realized, hey, we need infrastructure for our technical team to sell Amazon products, right? To be able to scale our Amazon warehouses, to be able to scale all the stuff that we're going to be doing for the book selling and then eventually product selling, we need to scale this. So that's how AWS got created. Essentially, it was a need that they had internally. And then they identified, hey, this is a very potential business model that we can have. We're probably not going to be making money in the first few years, but eventually it can be profitable. And indeed, that's what we're finding is that these cloud services are essentially offering, can be retailed, right? And if we look online, for example, like cloud businesses, cloud service providers, okay, a lot of them have their own infrastructure, like IBM. If you look at something like Vultr, VULTR, this company offers cloud services as well too. What's very interesting though is that some of these companies, for example, I believe Vultr is one of them, they resell AWS. So, for example, they will have their own AWS environment and they're essentially reselling it to you, but at a higher price, or because there's some sort of configuration that they have that they've programmed a certain way or they're configured. So you also have Google Cloud Service Provider. You have Alibaba as a cloud service provider, DigitalOcean. We showed you the marketplace as to how much of the market each one owns. But AWS is definitely the biggest stakeholder in the cloud market environment. I think it's what was it when we looked at the charts? I think it was like 34% of the market, followed by Azure. So they definitely take the lead on this. Okay, so up to this point, we have identified that on the left, this is our root user, and on the right, this is our general user that we created. Let us not worry about, however you want to do your user permissions, whichever one you want to do. Point is, I'm just going to jump straight into an S3 bucket, and we're going to start working with another product, which is AWS S3. All right, so within cloud computing, there's a term that is called serverless. Have any of you heard of the term serverless before? Serverless computing? It's kind of a weird name. It's a misnomer because the idea is you don't have to deal with the server. I think serverless is a misnomer because at the end of the day, you are dealing with a server, but it's just not, you're not dealing with the server directly. All right. So remember when we built our apps on DigitalOcean? That's an example of serverless. I'm going to give you another example here of serverless using an S3 bucket. So the idea with serverless is that it's low code, no code, in the sense that we can just upload documents, we can upload our resources, and then we can view them online without having to worry about servers. All right, so for this example, I do have a little bit of documentation that you can follow along. So if you do want to follow this example here, you can go into our Cloud Class 2 tutorial link here, which I'll pull up. Yeah, and I'll share the link with all of you here on the chat. So this actually breaks down what we're doing in AWS. And so we've done the management console. We create a new user. I'm jumping straight to number 5. We'll go back to number 4 for the EC2 in just a minute. But if you want to follow along with this for this S3, you can get the files that I'm going to be working with here. So let me give you a scenario. All right. Let's say we are a company and we need to uh, let's say we work at Starship Industries, right? And we identify, hey, there's a need that we need to put the launch times for our starships, all right, as they go off to space. So there's different ways we can do that, right? We can create a website, we can put up the files, but let's say we identify, okay, there's an Excel sheet that we need to put up that's going to have all the things that we need. So here are the files that I'm going to work with, okay? I'm going to be working with an HTML file. So this is going to be the web page that I'm going to have. I'm going to have images that are going to go onto my web page. I'm going to have cascading style sheets. So this is going to be my CSS to make my web page look nice. But more importantly, I'm going to have data that I need to use. All right. So in this example, I've already created my files. I already have my files that are set, but now I need to put them online on a server. All right. But I don't want to deal with the server. Dealing with the server is a lot of work. As you saw with DigitalOcean, when you create a droplet or when you create a virtual machine or create a server, there's a lot of things that you have to configure yourself so that way you can then get it to a point where you can launch the information or put it online. So we're going to make a website. We're going to make a website using serverless tools, which again is a weird name because at the end of the day, this is going to be resting on a server. But let's say I have this data, a simple data on an Excel sheet, where I see the hours of the launch times for spaceships. And here are the spaceships that I have. And actually, I'm going to change this to from wave height to spaceships. All right. Actually, I'll just leave it as wave height. That's fine. Uh, I want to put this data online. So I'm going to use something called the S3 buckets. The way to think of an S3 bucket or a bucket is that you have, think of literal buckets that you can just put information in. And as you're putting the information in, you make them publicly available. All right. So let's go ahead and make our first bucket here. So you can see I'm in my global environment. So when we're dealing with buckets, an S3 bucket, this deals with a global environment in the sense that it's applicable to every single region that you have. And when I create my bucket, all right, uh, I can specify in this area, in the settings here, in the configuration details, where I want to be storing them. And you can see that there are only specific areas that I can be putting them in. In this case, I'm going to be specifying Canada Central. Now, I have my bucket names, but because I'm working with a global environment, this has a global namespace, which means that if I do something like demo, for example, pretty sure that's going to be taken. So I have to be more specific with a unique name. So in this case, I'm just going to call it S3 bucket Feb 2024, right? Now, here's where I can establish ownership of it. In this case, I'm just going to go with the defaults. Now, I need to make my bucket data public. So I'm going to be removing the block all public access. Notice how I get a warning here telling me that I need to acknowledge that my settings will have an impact on the privacy of the information I'm putting in. In this case, everything that I put in is going to be public. I'm going to want to enable versioning controls so that way as people go up and upload and move things, I can manage those things and check what they're doing. I'm going to leave the encryption as defaults, all right? No need to worry there. And for my advanced settings, I don't really need to worry about too much as well there too, so I'm going to leave those defaults. And I'm going to create my first bucket. And if there are no issues, boom, it makes a bucket. So the best way to think about this is that I'm getting now a space on the cloud, right? Notice how I didn't have to configure any passwords. I didn't have to configure any users. I didn't have to configure any compute or storage or anything like that. I essentially am just going to be creating a place where I can put my resources. So here's my bucket. And you can see that I have my objects and I need to upload my objects to be able to store them on here. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm just going to grab my files, okay? I don't want my policy there, but I do want my index and I want my styles. I'll get into the policy in just a minute. I'm just going to drag and drop them in here. I'm going to drag and drop my resources in here. All right. And you can see now I have my files that are uploaded in my bucket. I can see the total size of my bucket, how many items have been in there, and the destination. And I'm just going to upload my files. All right. So what's happening here? Again, Notice how with the management console, I'm having access to create a server, an instance, to be able to store information on the cloud. This is not for storage though. I'm trying to make this information publicly available to the general public so that by the end, we can have a website that people can access to be able to view our content. What's really nice about the management plane and working with tools like AWS is that they break down the statuses for each thing. So it'll actually verify and check, hey, did this actually upload? Is this actually correct? Is this compatible with us? So you don't have to think twice about those things. So now when I go into my files, you can see I have my index file, my main file, my planet file. And so for example, like my images, you'll notice that there is a public URL that's available for my assets, right? Right now it's currently not associated, like there's an access deny, and that's because I need to modify the permissions and configurations for my web page. So for example, this is where we're going to be using something like JSON. JSON. Has anyone worked with JSON before? JavaScript object notation. It's a very human readable format for being able to manage data. And within AWS, JSON is what's utilized to be able to manage permissions as well too. So let's go ahead and use JSON to be able to manage our permissions here, right? So I'm going to go to my S3 bucket, okay? And then after that, I'm going to go to my permissions. All right. And I'm going to establish what's known as a policy. Remember, policies are those things similar to identity access management that we did that allow control for giving permission for certain things and usage as well too. In this case, I have my policy written out, and within my policy, it looks like this. So let me just grab the whole thing. All right, I'm going to edit my policy here. And that way I'm going to want to make everything available. So you can see I have my ID for my policy, what version it's going to be, the specific statement. So this is essentially JSON for modifying the policies that I want. You'll see here that I have my bucket ARN. I believe that's called the Amazon resource number, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm going to specify what resource I'm going to be using from my AWS, specifically my S3 bucket. I'm going to update my resource name. And look, notice how when I originally didn't have it there, it picked that up. It told me, hey, there's something that's missing. There's something that's not supported. So as you're building these things, right, Amazon will tell you how to build these things or essentially like check to make sure that it's in the correct format, right? So here we're using JavaScript object notation to be able to essentially update our policy. We're going to save our changes now. So let's look at the permissions that we have. We're given public access to view the objects. We are essentially blocking any private access so everything can be public. And you'll notice that the block all public access is off. We have our our public bucket policy. And then after that, we also need to identify some properties that we want to change as well too. In this case, we want to make a web page. So here we can just go into the static web hosting, and we can modify this to enable. Here we're going to specify our HTML file, which is going to be index.html. All right, we're going to save that. And essentially, as I'm doing this, what I want you to notice is essentially how we've been able to put something together, right? With a bucket or using buckets that essentially we just throw, we're throwing we're throwing information out there, right? We're putting information on our we're putting information on a bucket. It's available. It's publicly available. It's accessible, and then we're essentially consolidating our information into a single web page. So just taking a step back to what we did, the purpose of this example is to show you serverless computing and how we can just throw in resources. And notice how we didn't really have to deal with a console, as in like a command line interface. We didn't have to deal with, think back to what we did in DigitalOcean. We didn't have to deal with adding users, having SSH keys, when we were, or even coding as well too. Essentially, we're just saying, here are some files we have. Let's make these files publicly accessible. And the files we had were very basic. They were just an HTML file with essentially an Excel sheet that we've already had programmed. Essentially, the HTML and the Excel file are already coded to work together. And we're just throwing in the resources to be able to make it publicly available. And so now if I go to this public access point here, I will have my web page with my spaceship launch times. And everyone, all of you, can have access to this to be able to view it. All right, so if you want, you can go ahead and see our web page that we built. Now, you might be asking, well, what if I want to take this a step further and I don't want to have it S3 bucket Feb 2024? I want to have it on a specific domain. This is where AWS works with its own products and where you have to keep the product line within itself. So if you want to be able to customize that, then you're going to be doing Route 53. Route 53 is for DNS management, DNS services. It's called Route 53 because DNS usually works on port 53. But then this is what's going to allow you to be able to connect your domain to the S3 bucket. The reason why I'm explaining this to you is because, or illustrating this is because notice in the architecture, it's all about using everything with the AWS environment. Any questions with the S3 bucket example? Straightforward? Yeah, okay. Again, main thing I wanted to illustrate here with the S3 bucket, or the, excuse me, the Amazon S3s is essentially illustrating how easy it is to just put on a website, right? And the thing is, you don't even need to put in an HTML code. You can even just upload a file, all right? You can upload a PDF file and say, okay, we're going to make this publicly available so that people can view it. And then that way you have a file stored that's publicly accessible. Abdul, go ahead.
Can we have permissions and privileges on through this as well, or it's not possible? So
Permissions?
yeah,
What kind of permissions?
you want to log in page and different layers, menu, hamburger menu, etc., etc. Like kind of that kind of website can also be built through this, or it has to be like a simple single page website is what we're looking at,
That's a
like
good,
a full-fledged website, or just a
yeah,
simple
that's a
website.
good question. I think if you're going to want to do a full-fledged website like that, I think you're going to want to go with something different, either like Elastic Beanstalk or an EC2 machine. And the
Mm.
only reason why I say that, and this is my observation with the products, is that even though you are dealing with the same thing there, S3 bucket is really just for resource allocation or throwing in resources. And if we look into the buckets description here, let's see. No, I don't want an account snapshot. General purpose buckets. Objects stored in Amazon is stored in any number of objects up to 100 objects. So my understanding with S3 buckets is that you're mainly going to be doing object storage with that, right? Um, but that's a fair question about putting in a password or something like that. I do think though, as far as I'm aware, you can modify your permissions for your buckets so that you don't necessarily have to create a password or anything like that. You can make it so that specific users can have access to. So like a company intranet, for example, right? If you want to have resources that are only available to your employees, then you can use the S3 bucket and then modify the policies and permissions so that it's only people within your AWS network or within your community. Um, for something like if you're going to be trying to do like your project, like the ERP, I would suggest going with like an EC2 machine or Lightsail. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, yeah. Right.
But
Thanks.
let me see, like passwords.
I think using EC2 machine is much more easier because you can deployment, you can make changes, you can do patch releases.
Yeah.
That becomes more easier, isn't it?
So it seems like there is a way to create a password secured S3 bucket. Security best practices for Amazon S3. Log me once, I guess, offers something. So what you're asking is seems like it is possible. I haven't done it, but it seems like when access controls ACLs are disabled, access control for your data is based on policies such as identity access management. So you can manage it based on identity access management, like users. So we can say Bob only uses this. We can have S3 bucket policy. We can have VPC, virtual private cloud, and then organizational services. So there are some ways you can do it. Maybe not the traditional way of having a web page with a username and password. It's just based off the console management and configuration that you set in the management plane.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so that's S3 buckets. Very easy stuff, right? Um, and yeah, we were able to create our simple web page there to be able to just illustrate like, hey, you know, here's just a very simple way how we can get, um, you know, an Excel sheet with some HTML, with some CSS, with some pictures, and just have a very basic web page that we can upload You know, how long did that take us? Like 5 minutes, right? And maybe we're not the ones making the files and the content. Sometimes we'll have a developer and they'll just give us the stuff and we gotta say, okay, just throw it up somewhere, right? So I think this is a great way to like have quick turnaround stuff. Like for example, uh, like there have been times where it's like, hey, for one day we need to have a web page that illustrates this information, right? That we're giving out publicly. Okay, let's just throw it on a bucket, right? And just make it publicly available. Actually, I've been surprised. There's a lot of companies now that I'm looking at. When you go through their web pages, if you look at the PDFs, right, where they're storing the PDFs, sometimes you'll see it that it's in an S3 bucket. Like you'll see the Amazon AWS.com at the end, right, when you're downloading a PDF. So, anyways, yeah, that's an example of the buckets there.